Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Howdy. My friends, and I know you are my friends, because I couldn't put my enemies in a little old room like this. No, I do appreciate everybody coming out this morning, and particularly at this early hour. At least it's early for me. Okay, today we're going to be talking about remote viewing aliens. All right, now that sounds pretty weird, but you haven't heard nothing yet. All right, first I've got to qualify the audience. Let me see a quick show of hands. How many of you know what I mean by remote viewing and know a little bit about remote viewing? Whoa, all right, that looks pretty good. All right, for the rest of you, don't worry, you're not going to lose out. But I'm going to whiz on through some of the introductory things so that we can get to the good stuff. Remote viewing began as a response to the old Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, we know we took all the Nazi rocket scientists and mind control experts and medical biochemical warfare guys, and we took all of them. It turns out they actually had a unit within the German military that, interestingly enough, was codenamed MAJIK, M-A-J-I-K. Now, those of you who know about the Majestic 12 documents, you'll realize that originally it was MAJIK 12, M-A-J-I-C, which is the anglicized version. So actually, it makes you wonder if maybe we picked up some of their psychic people too. We may have, but not very much, because at that point in time, in fact, well on up into almost the 80s, our military minds didn't think that, like most people, a lot of people still today, that, oh, there's nothing to psychic stuff, that's just woo-woo, and that doesn't work. Well, the Soviets didn't take that view. They actually got the MAJIK personnel, and they began to work quite seriously along with their Eastern European allies and begin to work on psychic abilities and nailing it down. They called them extrasensors. And they begin to make work and have some progress. A lot of you folks who are about my age may recall that back about 1970, 75, somewhere in there was a book that came out called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And it was pretty popular, and it showed that they were making headway in determining the reality and the operational use of remote viewing, which is what we came to call it. Russell Targ here and Dr. Harold Puthoff in the late 70s. Puthoff had been with Naval Intelligence, and they actually began to work with the CIA in developing some of the remote viewing. Here you can see one of their early efforts. They remote viewed a landing strip and a hangar and down wherever it was, Columbia. And as you can see from the photograph, they did a pretty good job with it. After the trial and error by the CIA, which then moved the experiments to Stanford Research Institute in California, and they brought in Uri Geller, a well-known psychic, and they brought in Ingo Swann, who had been doing psychic research in New York. And they actually began to get it going. And then about 1975, 76, when the Church Committee began to come out with their revelations about how that the U.S. intelligence agencies had been using all kinds of strange methods to assassinate people around the world, including giving Fidel Castro toxic cigars, and they were going to try to get him with some kind of poisoned shellfish and all kinds of weird stuff. The CIA decided maybe they better divest themselves of any questionable program. So they passed along their psychic research to the U.S. Army. And eventually they created an operational unit of about 24 people, headquartered here. What you see here is the former bakery school at Fort Meade, Maryland. and they turned it into their remote viewing center headquarters. And according to the guys that were there, it looked pretty, as you can see, it looked pretty nondescript on the outside. But Dave Morehouse told me that the first time he arrived there, he thought, what is this old ramshackle wooden building? But then he got up there and found out they had a super high-tech push-button security and steel door on it. And he went, what is with this? And went inside, and it looked like a bunch of hippies were living there. There were psychedelic posters on the wall and plants hanging off the thing everywhere. And so they really had something going there. I'm not about to go through all this, but this is basically the chronology of the development of remote viewing. They first began to call it Scan 8 because that was scanning by coordinate, and they still refer to it as coordinate remote viewing. It took me a long time, and I like to think of myself as smart, but it took me a long time to figure out what they mean by these coordinates. And basically, they are meaningless except for the thought concept in the mind of the person who comes up with the coordinates. But to back off, to begin with, they were actually using longitude, latitude coordinates, and then giving the coordinates to potential remote viewers, and then seeing how accurate they may be. In other words, if they gave them a coordinate for the North Pole, and the viewer began to describe white and ice and snow, and I see a bear and he's all white, well then they know that he was on target. But after a while they realized that you didn't need to have a longitude, latitude, absolute coordinate, that any number representing the target. And the best I can explain this to you, and this is very simplistic, and I can't even guarantee you this is the way it works, but what I figured out was, if I think of a target, let's say the Eiffel Tower, well, of course, I can't tell you as a remote viewer, go remote view the Eiffel Tower, because immediately you've either been there, you've seen pictures of it, and you get a mental picture of the Eiffel Tower, and then it's going to be pretty difficult to distinguish between the soft, subtle, psychic signal and just your daydreams or your thought pictures. So what I would do is give you a coordinate, 14598602. All you got is that number. But in my mind, I realize that number correlates to the Eiffel Tower. Now, when I think this, and I think the Eiffel Tower, and I think that number, that is a thought form. That is an energy form. And that energy form goes on to the great universal energy grid, which we are all connected to. And if you want to get scientific about it, this is Einstein's unified field theory. The idea that we're all one and the universe is nothing but one big seething mass of energy. I'd like to think this wooden podium, it's solid. If I hit you over the head with it, trust me, your head's going to hurt. But yet, rationally, we know that this wooden podium is nothing but a bunch of atoms mushed together. And when you stop and think about an atom, 98% of the atom is just empty space. Except it's not really empty. You've got electrons and neutrons, and they're all flashing around in there. So what I'm telling you is that we live in an energy field. And that's the entire universe. And that's when you hear people talk about psychic things. You hear about things like Rife technology, where they use frequencies to, elevate your emotions or to cure you of certain diseases. This is why it works, because you are manipulating the energy field. So they began to realize that all you had to do was come up with a number, and that thought form goes out on the grid. And if you are trained enough or sensitive enough, then you pick up on that thought form, and your attention psychically, mentally, is directed towards the target. And then you begin to self-interrogate yourself as to the target. And you just go through basic questions. You know, is this natural, man-made? Well, it's man-made. Is it tall or short? It's tall. Are there people around it? Yeah, there's a lot of people around it. Is it in the Western Hemisphere? No. Is it in the Europe? Yes. Is it in a big city? Yes. And you just keep going until pretty soon you go, well, it's tall, it's metal, got a lot of people around. It's a big city. It's a big city in Europe, and it must be the Eiffel Tower. And this is how the whole thing works. About 1995, just as I was prepared to break this story, I thought it was going to be a great scoop for an old newsman here, because I'd been interviewing the people and studying this for about 2 years. They suddenly hired Ray Hyman, who was a member of Skeptic and had been opposed to this whole thing ever since the beginning, so you can pretty much figure how objective he was about it. And a statistician named Jessica Utz were hired by the CIA to analyze and judge their work with remote viewing. And at the same time, they very mysteriously canceled my book, even though it was just about on the way to the printers. And it had gone through legal vetting, it had gone through all the proofing. They even had advanced sales. And there was really no explanation. In fact, there was a bunch of strange stuff. The editor I'd worked with suddenly got offered a better job, left. They took the whole project out of the hands of the attorneys for the publisher that I'd been working with. This was Harmony Books, wholly owned subsidiary of Random House, who long has been rumored to be a CIA front. And it went to another lawyer who I was told not to contact. And he said, we have to cancel this book. Anyway, it was very strange. And just as they canceled the book, they ordered up this study, and with a few weeks, Hyman and Utz came back, and it was kind of odd, because thanks to Ray Hyman, they were trying to say, well, there's really nothing here and nothing to remote viewing, and yet they messed up by getting Jessica Utz involved, because she said, well, statistically, something's happening here. But we don't really know what it is, so the CIA said, so we're discontinuing this. It was a limited hangout, because by this time it was already out of the hands of the CIA, and the Army had been using it operationally. Their unit in the Army went through several name changes. I'm not sure why. Nobody's sure why. Most of these names, by the way, I was told were computer generated. But it was known as Stargate, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Eagle Claw, Dragoon, Absorb, Sunstreak. Who knows where they come up with these names. I finally realized that I think the reason they canceled my book was not because I was telling the story of remote viewing. Hal Puthoff and Targ had already published a book called Mind Reach, where they had described their experiments with remote viewing. And Joe McMoneagle had already published a book. Dave Morehouse was working on one, even though the Army tried to discredit him, tried to run him out. I know one time I had to visit him at Walter Reed Army Hospital, and he was so drugged up he could barely hold his head up. It was really pretty sad. And they tried to discredit him. Anything to try to distract attention from this whole idea of remote viewing. So since they were already going to be talking about remote viewing, why did they cancel my book? And I'll tell you why. UFOs. Because early on, all of them were talking about and just going on and on about UFOs, but I knew back then, this was in the 90s, if I had tried to say something about, here's the Army and they're looking at UFOs, even a lot of the public would have just rolled their eyes and gone, man, these guys have gone over the edge. So, what I had done in preparing this manuscript was just start with the concept of remote viewing, and then I went back and showed the historical precedents. For example, even in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there is a prophetess by the name of Deborah, and the Israelite army was getting ready to go into a big battle with a force probably twice its size. And she went to the commander of the Israelite forces and said, "I've had a vision, and I can tell you what the disposition of the enemy troops are." And based on her information, the outnumbered Israelites actually won the battle. Here we go, one of the first military remote viewers. And then it comes all the way on up, and of course, and through the occultism of the 20s and 30s. And so it was really nothing new. And in fact, this whole ability of remote viewing, when they did the studies at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, they found out two amazing things. Number one, everybody they tested showed some ability to do this. Now, that doesn't mean that you can sit down in a chair right now and go, see what's happening on Jupiter. But what it means is that we all have this innate psychic ability. Of course, that's like saying we all have the ability to play Mozart on the piano. Well, I can guarantee you there's a lot of you that's going to do it a lot better than me. But if I actually took piano lessons and then practiced day after day after day, yeah, I could get to where I could play Mozart on the piano. So we all had the ability. The second thing that blew me away was they actually did experiments and tests, and they found out that remote viewing is not limited by time or space. You can look back in time, you can look forward in time. You can look at the other side of the world, you can even go out in space. In the early 70s, Ingo Swann and another fellow did a remote viewing of Jupiter, and they came up with some surprising data. They said there was actually a little ring around Jupiter, and that there was some sort of atmosphere, and that it had an energy field, and they saw these big mountains, mountainous regions on Jupiter. Well, that was stuff nobody had ever heard that before. And they ran that past some of the astronomers and scientists, and they all went, "Well, that's interesting." But, who knew? But then in the late 70s, I think about 79, they sent Voyager out. And it circles Jupiter, and it takes all this data readings and photographs, comes back, and it verified everything that they had said. It's amazing. And I know it works because I even tried it myself. I was due to come to Albuquerque to what I'd been told was the headquarters of a remote viewing company. This was some of the people who had already gotten out of the Army and decided they were going to take this into the corporate field, and they were going to get corporate sponsors, and they were going to remote view, say, for General Motors to find out what's going to be the next car design in 10 years, put them ahead of the competition. So I was fortunate in that years before, as a reporter, I'd been assigned to do a story on transcendental meditation. And when I talked to the fellow there in Fort Worth who was running that whole thing, he said, "Well, look, instead of me just talking to you, why don't I just run you through the course?" And I said, "Okay, fine, sure, that sounds good." And I said, "But let me tell you something." I said, I was brought up a Southern Baptist. I don't buy that Eastern, woo-woo stuff, He said, "Don't worry about it." He said, "You don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to change your religious views." He said, "These are techniques that have been handed down for thousands of years. And if you'll simply follow the techniques, you can go into a meditative state, and it will really improve you mentally and physically." And I said, "Okay, I'm game." And so I was given a mantra, and I was told how to sit quietly, clear your mind, and just let thoughts go. Don't hang on to anything. And sure enough, I could get a meditative state. So I was a leg up in that I already knew how to sit down and get meditative. And so I sat down in a big comfortable chair, and I thought, okay, I want to view the headquarters of their company. Well, I got a clear picture, at least mentally. I got this impression of a single-story strip shopping center, and on the edges of the corners of the building, there was something jutting out. Okay, and then I actually got a view of where I could see the floor plan, and I sketched that up, complete to writing down reception area, large conference room, hallway, offices. Well, I very proudly took it out to Albuquerque, and I said, "Here, I remote view this place." Well, it turns out their office was simply this guy's ranch-style home. And so I thought, well, I guess I'm not worth anything as a remote viewer. And I threw my paper over to him and left that. Well, about a year later, I came back to Albuquerque. And this time, they had not had much success in getting corporations to fund them to do remote viewing, but they had some success in teaching people remote viewing. So they had gone out and leased some office space in a brand new office complex that was one-story strip shopping center looking place, and on each corner up at the top there were things jutting out. But the only mistake I made was what I found out later was what is called analytic overlay. I got the impression of this, and then instead of just going with my impression, my conscious left brain mind's going, "Oh, well, I'm going to Albuquerque, it's into Mexico, it must be that southwestern architecture where you get the wooden poles that stick out the top of the thing." Well, it wasn't wooden poles, it was lions' heads jutting out from the sides of the building. So that was the only mistake. The color was the same, the shape was the same. And then they handed me the official floor plan of this office building, and it matched my drawing 100%. Right down to the words reception area, hallway, large conference room. In fact, I now believe that what I was remote viewing was not the actual building, but I think I remote viewed the floor plans, and that's why it matched up. So anyway, I was impressed because that building had not been built at the time I did the remote viewing. So I know that it works. And so the reason that they canceled my book is because I made it too believable. I did my homework, and they did not want anything out in a credible manner to show the reality of UFOs. Here were some of the remote viewers of the unit that I dealt with. Ingo Swan, what a fascinating fellow. Joe McMonagle, Lynn Buchanan, who was their training officer. Mel Riley, who was just a down-to-earth, good old boy, and yet one of the best remote viewers they had. That goes all the way back. When he was a young man, he was out walking in the forest, came to a clearing, thought he heard a noise, turned around, and here was an Indian village. And smoke coming up out of the teepees, and the skins stretched out in front of the teepees, dogs running around, kids playing. And he's just going, "Wait a minute, I've been in this clearing, many times. That wasn't here before. And what's this?" And then, interestingly enough, one of the Indians turned and looked at him, and he kind of waved, and the Indian waved back. Somehow or another, he had actually transported himself back, or at least in some way was visible to this village, which then disappeared and obviously was not there. He had gone back in time. So it got to be a clash between the extrasensors of the Soviet Union and the remote viewers of the United States, and as they would very often meet each other in the ether, if you want to call it that, and were aware that the other side was there. And of course, at first it was like, oh, here comes the commies, But then after a while, they realized that they were only there in mental form, psychic form, and that they weren't there physically, and they couldn't do anything to each other. So after a while, it was kind of like that cartoon, Warner Brothers cartoon with the sheepdog and the coyote or the wolf or whatever. Good morning, Fred. Good morning, Joe. They just went about their business. But nevertheless, they were never officially tasked to go look at UFOs because the government, of course, then and now basically is trying to tell us there's no such thing. But yet, every single one of them, now, all of them will not tell you this. Some of them will talk your ear off about UFOs. Others will say, well, I saw some very anomalous things, but that's about as far as they'll go. And some of them either just say, well, I'm not going to talk about that, or I don't know what you're talking about. But yet, every single one of the military-trained remote viewers encountered UFOs, and they understand the reality of it. And then there's even interesting things to show that there is something going on. In 1993, they launched a Titan IV rocket, and you can read here, it says, in a strange twist, the Frank Sterling Titan IV program director said that the Air Force video of the launch shows an unidentified object apparently striking the Titan at an altitude of 110,000 feet shortly before the rocket blew up. Well, what was that? Well, the remote viewers took a look at that, and they decided it was what they call a buckyball. Bucky, of course, named after Buckminster Fuller, because it's a multifaceted object about the size of a hand grenade. And they tell me, and more than one have described these, and they said these are up in orbit. They're mirror-like, silver gray, faceted, hard, smooth, has a luster, kind of a crystalline structure. And they have seen these things when they launch a communication satellite, they just keep floating. Satellite goes up, goes in orbit. But when they launch one of these classified military satellites, which, contrary to all conventions, may very well be carrying weapons, and particularly nuclear weapons, into orbit, one of these buckyballs will drop out of orbit, go down, hit it, and oh gee, we lost that one. And if you'll think back, there's been several. Yeah. Maybe somebody's trying to take care of us, right? Say, well, I figure that UFO activity has been here all through history, but it really picked up starting about 1946, 47, right? And what were we doing? Setting off atomic weapons. Somewhere up there, somebody said, holy cow, the kids found the matches. And so apparently goes more to than just hovering around looking at us. One of the best remote viewers they ever found for their testing, and he was never an official member of the Army unit, but he certainly worked with them at SRI, was Pat Price. Pat Price was a former police detective, and he'd been quite successful. And I can see why, because he was really good psychically, and I think he had great intuition. And they tested him and found out he was probably one of the best remote viewers they had ever found. So one day he comes in and says, hey, I was looking around and I found 4 alien bases on the Earth. One's at Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees between Spain and France. One's on Mount, and you can pronounce that one for yourself, Nyangani in Zimbabwe. And then there's Mount Zeal in Australia and Mount Hayes in Alaska. And they all went, oh, Pat, that's nice. Great. Good job, buddy. Want some coffee? Because how do you prove something like that? But they filed it away. Much later in 1998, Skip Atwater, who became the executive officer of the Grill Flame unit, and he was tasked sometimes to give them exotic and weird tasks, just to see really what they could do. Well, he remembered Pat Price's remote viewing of the 4 alien bases, so he gives them the coordinate number, which represented these bases. And sure enough, they all come back and they say, gee, these are bases here on Earth, and these are manned by, we see aliens, non-humans working there. As I recall, the base in the pyramids that was like the operational base, and this is they come and go. And that's really interesting because when I was in southern France in the Pyrenees, it would be a beautiful clear blue sky. And yet over here at this one little mountain kind of stood off by itself, it's called the Piche Gardou. And every day the sky would be beautiful, clear blue, but over Piscadoo there's a little cloud hanging over the top of the mountain every day. And so this professor who was with the university in Holland, and I asked him, I said, why is there always a cloud hanging over this mountain over there? And quite matter of factly, he says, oh, that's where the ships come in and out. Okay. The one in Zimbabwe, the basin of Zimbabwe, that was like the repair shop. That's where they went for repairs, refitting, whatever. The base in Australia, they said this was the R&R place. This was where they would see a variety of non-humans interacting with each other. And this is, I guess, where the canteen was and the rec room or whatever. That's where they go to relax. And then the base at Mount Zeal in Alaska, they said this is kind of the weather station. This is their monitoring station for keeping tabs on the weather and the environment on the planet Earth. But anyway, that was kind of amazing that what Pat Price had seen is now verified by an official Army viewing of these 4 alien bases. But what was, to me, was even more astounding was that Skip Atwater, in 1998, came to the 7th Annual International UFO Congress, some of you may remember that, and made a presentation and told all about this. And I was sitting in the audience just going, wow. And Skip, love him as I do, he's not a very dynamic presenter. He was just standing there going, yes, alien bases for we found on the planet Earth, and you know. And I looked around, and the audience was kind of sparse, and a lot of people were kind of nodding, you know. And there was no news media there. And I'm sitting there as a former editor, reporter. I'm going, holy crap! We got a decorated, retired U.S. military intelligence agent publicly telling us that they've confirmed 4 alien bases on the planet. And nothing happens. It never made the news. It never went anywhere. This is why, folks, you know, I hate to say this about my own profession, but there is no news media in this country. Oh, man, I'm running out of time, so we got to keep going. They also determined what happened to the Mars Observer because they saw an object come off the planet Mars, approach it, beam it, not in a hostile way. They described it as the tugboats coming out to the Queen Mary, but it scrambled the onboard computer and the Mars Observer crashed into the planet. Okay, now that sounds great. Was there any feedback? Yes, there was. In 1989, Marina Popovich, a Soviet astronaut, came and revealed that one of the last photographs taken by the Phobos 2, which the same thing happened to it. And as you can see, there is a somewhat slight correlation between what they photographed approaching the Phobos 2 and the object that was drawn by remote viewers. All right. Now, I've lost my graphic. This is what happens when you take a PowerPoint presentation and put it on another computer. Thanks, Bill. All right, we all know about the UFO crash in Aztec. It's been kicked around a long time, ever since 1950. Frank Scully wrote and said there were 4 UFO recoveries about that time, and one taking place around Aztec. 16 humanoid bodies were recovered from an undamaged craft. And he gives the dimensions, and he said they were taken to Wright Field, which is now, of course, Wright-Patterson, and bodies dissected, examined by the Air Force, found very similar to be human beings. But, of course, there's been controversy over this for years. This was a really nice picture of me and Linda Howe and several other, Stanton Freeman, I think, was in the picture, and there we all are. Thanks, Bill. But there's been a lot of controversy about Aztec, and most people in New Mexico will tell you, oh, that never happened because, you know, if the Army came in, we would have known about it. Well, the reason that nobody much knows about it is because Aztec is right up near the Colorado border. And they had been tracking this object just like they had been tracking the object prior to the crash at Roswell. And when it came down and essentially landed, this was not really a crash. They immediately rushed Army units out of Colorado, and they slipped across the border, and they came in, cordoned off the area, got hold of the whole thing, grabbed it, took off, went right back across the border into Colorado. And that's why most people in New Mexico quite legitimately could say, well, I never heard anything about that. That never happened. So what I'm bringing you here now, and this is maybe the first time you all have heard about this, was in 2009, Randy Barnes of the Aztec Library Association, which has been very active in trying to keep the story of the Aztec incident going, contracted with Problem Solutions Innovations, which is now headed by Lynn Buchanan, who was the training officer of the Army's remote viewing unit. And he set up a panel of 11 documented remote viewers to take a look at Aztec and see if indeed it happened. And here's what they found. Large object came in, went to ground. It was very, very large, designed for transportation, silvery gray, black color. There were people observing this. They already knew it was coming, and they were very interested and somewhat happy to see it. And there was an attitude among these people like, hey, coming at you, we're here. It's going to hurt because we're going to get you. And one or more biologists were biologicals. Biologicals, that's what they call the entities, were disabled or hurt. And they were trying to help them, but they could not communicate with them. And then the Army shows up, teams of people in helmets, protective clothing, doing construction, deconstruction work, and these teams appeared to work in shifts. You know, one would get in, do whatever they had to do, and then the next shift would come in. And then they took these people that they had taken from this crash to an undisclosed building, probably Wright-Patterson. But they had a problem. These people, apparently, there was some mental communication, some telepathy involved. But even more so, they began to realize that they could, by telepathy, they could interfere or they could manipulate the minds of their captors. So now they got a real problem because they know they're not going to be able to hold them, and yet they can't turn them loose and tell them to go home because they've torn their ship apart. In fact, one of the remote viewers pretty well said it looked like a Cadillac that had been left in Harlem on a Saturday night. You know, it just sitting on Coke crates, I guess. And so they couldn't send them back, and so they were trying to negotiate with them, and they realized they could manipulate mentally, and so there was an official decision made to execute them. And what he told me was that it was reminiscent of Lake Titicaca, a big, beautiful lake up in the mountains. And then he found himself moving up an inclined causeway. There was a big pyramidal building, and there was a long causeway, kind of a ramp, that went through a dimly lit rectangular corridor constructed of smoothly dressed stone on all sides. And as he went into this structure, he said, this is an entrance to a beautiful white pyramid-type structure on a rocky-like promontory, and there were two obelisks, I guess you would call them, on either side. Very majestic place, very quiet place. He got the very, very sincere feeling that this was like a sacred place. And he went up there, got inside. There was like almost an altar or a stone dais in the middle of it, and he was kind of drawn to it. He said actually this was a familiar place, and he felt like he was home. And he went and laid down on this, and these hooded figures came and stood around him, exuding a very benevolent feeling towards him, and that there was something streaming down from the ceiling, light or energy. And he said he felt so good he didn't want to leave the place, but basically he told him, sorry, you're not here in your normal time, you've got to go back. And so he was sent back. They laid down, the light was coming from overhead, and they put a hand out over his solar plexus, and all this time he didn't feel fear. He felt very, very much at home and very, very relaxed. In a totally different remote viewing, everybody asked, well, what about God? What about, the universe? What about religion? How is that going to be affected by if the UFO issue becomes totally public? There's disclosure, and we all know they're there. Personally, I don't see any problem, because if there is a God, if He created the earth, if He created us, well, then He created the universe, right? And He created all these other people. And I'm not even alone in that viewpoint, because as most of you know, the Vatican now has come out in the form of Signor Balducci, who says, yes, there are other people out there. They're not demons and they're not angels. They're just different folks. And this is what the remote viewers saw. They went out there and they found that almost every species that they encountered or had any kind of interaction with, psychically, mentally, talked about a world where they worshipped the One. And here you see A is one description and drawing of this world. B is a totally separate remote viewer, and yet you can see the similarities. They obviously are seeing the same thing. Distant planet, and on this planet is a city dedicated to the worship of the One, or sometimes called the All. And again, we see two different remote viewers, two separate ones, drawing an overhead view of this city. And obviously, although there are differences, they're obviously looking at the same place. This is the one I like. This is two separate remote viewers. And in here, and I don't need to point out the similarities. And both of them talk about water underneath, buildings, homes built into the sides of the mountains or the hills there, a lower area, a tall tower. And both of them noticed a red stripe around the top of the tower. Wherever my thing went, there you go, right in here. And right up in here. So, these are too similar to be some sort of coincidence. So this is where they worship the All, or the One. And that gets back to what I mentioned earlier about the fact that we are all part of the One. We are all part of the All. This is the universal consciousness. We are like your computer. Your computer materially is not much. It's a piece of plastic, and we got a little cardboard in there and some wiring and a little bit of solder. So what? The thing that makes your computer work and compute and essentially think is the little bits of electricity, bytes as they call them, moving around on these motherboards and amongst the little pieces of the computer. Now, individually, one of those little bytes of energy is pretty insignificant. But when you get a billion of them in there and they're all moving around and communicating with each other, then you've got what they call AI, artificial intelligence. And your computer can think, it can compute, it can add, subtract, and it can do all kinds of wonderful things. It can even, play music. It can have wars. It can do everything right there on your computer. Well, folks, we're the same thing. We are energy beings because we know that your brain, that's just a chunk of meat. They could actually recreate your brain. They could actually recreate your body. Kind of like Frankenstein. They knew this back in the 1800s. You could sew body parts together and put organs in it. They could recreate your body, but they cannot recreate you. Why is that? Because your body is energized by an energy field. Some of you may call it the aura or whatever. But it's an energy field, and it's the sum total of the energy of that field that makes for you the sentient, self-aware being that is yourself. Okay, now each and every one of us are kind of like those bytes in your computer. Individually, viewed, from a great distance, we may not be that much. But collectively, we can, and when you add every individual bit of energy with all of the rest of the bits of energy throughout the universe, collectively, you've got, I think, a sentient, self-aware being that is omnipotent, omnipresent, knows everything that's going on. Kind of fits the definition of God. And it's just unfortunate that we down here on earth are playing the game of the blind man and the elephant. You may recall that story. They took some blind men to the zoo to let them experience the elephant. And one's got his tail, and he says, "Oh, the elephant is like a rope." And the other's got his trunk. He says, no, the elephant is like a hose. And then the other one's got his ear, and they said, no, the elephant's like a fan. And the other one's up against the side of the elephant. He said, no, an elephant's like a wall. And the other one's got his leg. And he said, no, the elephant's like a column. And they actually get to fighting with each other and arguing over what's the elephant. They all got a piece of it, but they don't get the total picture. And unfortunately, that's where we are on this planet. Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. We all think we've got it, and we actually fight and kill each other. We're the blind man and the elephant. Now, this is what they saw as the people there on this world who were worshiping the One. Look somewhat like the Greys that we're familiar with, but some of them seem to have hair. And so, where exactly this is, they don't know, I don't know, you don't know. But there is a wide universe out there, and there's lots of weird stuff going on. And, I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to tell you the weirdest story you ever heard if you hadn't already heard it. A few years ago, back about in the early 90s, I guess, I was in Roswell, New Mexico, and we were doing a documentary. Interestingly enough, not on UFOs, but we needed a hospital that looked like an old hospital from the 50s. And we found it in the New Mexico Rehabilitation Center. And so I was in there talking to the executive secretary and asked her if we could come in this hospital and shoot. And she said, sure. Said, you can go up on that wing over there, up on the second floor, go down there. Said, do all the shooting you want to do. Said, we mostly use that area for storage. Well, if she had left it at that, I would have said, thank you very much, and we'd gone about my business. But she had to add, the staff doesn't like to go up there. Well, you don't say something like that to an old reporter and expect to get by with it. So, of course, I said, well, why? Why don't they want to go up there? She said, because it's haunted. Oh, okay. Well, now, actually, this is nothing new for me. Anyone who's worked in a hospital, worked around hospitals like I have as a reporter, every hospital has ghost stories, okay, interestingly enough. But nevertheless, that piqued my interest. And so while the rest of the crew went on and they were doing their productions, I went around and talked to the people there at the hospital. I talked to the telephone operator who had been there 16 years. And before that, her mother had worked there and had been there for 20 years and went back into the early 50s and had heard the stories of the haunting on the second floor wing. So, whoa, this goes way on back there. It goes back to the early 50s, maybe even into the 40s. And talked to the maintenance people. They said, yeah, some of these are just good old boys. They're not making stuff up. They're going, yeah, it's pretty weird. Said at night we can hear footsteps up there, but we go up there and there's nobody there. And said then the elevators will go up and down. There's nobody there. We see lights come off and on, and yet there's nobody there. And said, I'm telling you, it's pretty spooky. And then we talked to some of the people there, and they're all telling us these stories. And finally, then I find out that this New Mexico Rehabilitation Center, here we go, had been the base hospital for Walker Air Force Base. And it was built back in the early 50s. And interestingly enough, the Walker Air Force Base had been built right over the exact site of the Roswell Army Airfield, which, of course, you all know the story about July the 4th. There's a crash. Supposedly they pick up these aliens. Stories vary. Some of them say they're all dead. Some say 2 or 3 were dead. One was still alive. And they were taken, of course, to the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital. There's a picture of it. And we all know the story of Glenn Dennis, who said he was contacted by the base, wanted to know if he had any sealed, small, childlike coffins. So you know the whole story. So here was the Walker Air Force Base, and right up here was the base hospital built right on the site of the old Roswell Army Airfield Hospital. So I'm thinking, well, boy, this is pretty wild. So we finally got hold of one of the nurses, Josie Morales, who said she had actually seen this apparition. And she got movement out of the corner of her eye late one night and turned around, and there was, she described it, she says, it was not human. So it was only about this high, had a big head, had big dark eyes. I'm going, holy cow, sounds like an alien. Sounds like one of those grays. So then we talked to another person who had seen it. They verified the same description. So, what? We got an alien ghost in Roswell, New Mexico? Now, that's pretty weird. But how do we find out about this? Here's what she said. It was shocking, and it happened to her twice. First time I didn't tell anybody because I figured they'd think I was crazy. But after I saw it a second time, I realized this was real. And I saw this figure no more than 5 foot tall, and a big old head, big dark eyes, hands that had no fingers. They looked like mittens, and it was wrapped in some sort of shiny cloth. It was definitely not human. And so we did more checking, and then a few years later, I had a contract with Discovery Channel, and we were going to do a series called Ex-Operatives. And our plan was, instead of just going somewhere and reporting on some strange thing, Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster or whatever, we were actually going to take a team of experts, and we were going to investigate and find out exactly what was going on there. So we decided for our pilot program, we were going to check out the alien ghost in Roswell. And my co-producer and I, our biggest fear was that we'd get to Roswell and nobody would talk to us, or that we'd set up all the cameras and we wouldn't get anything. But the exact opposite happened. People out there, Roswell is actually a very small little town. People are very friendly. The very people I'd talked to talked again. The assistant director told us the same story. We talked to Josie Morales. She told us the same story again. We found other people who'd also seen it. They told us the same story. And then we got some really strange stuff. We set up a camera, a big expensive type camera, late at night, turned off the air conditioning so there was nothing moving. We set up in one of the rooms where they had seen the apparition and put night vision on, and we actually got pictures of orbs floating through the room. And strange streaks of light, noises that we couldn't be traced to any sources. And we thought, boy, we got it. This is it. Move over, ghost hunters. You know, we've really got the stuff. Discovery Channel acted like they didn't know us. They said, well, this isn't what we contracted for. They dropped us like a hot rock. Folks, they don't want the truth out there. They just want to titillate you a little bit, okay? But on this particular picture right here, you can see this metal cabinet built into the wall. We were in this hallway, and we had our investigation group included a couple of guys with scientific equipment, an Indian shaman, 2 remote viewers, a psychic, and somebody else, I think. And we were standing there with the whole camera crew. The camera crew got freaked out, by the way. We were trying to film, and all of a sudden everything would just quit, and they couldn't explain it. And we'd move the stuff, and everything would work again. I mean, and even the camera crew, and any of y'all ever worked with professional camera crews, they've seen it all. Okay? Nothing phases them. And these guys were getting freaked out, all right, because there was something going on here. And so we're in the hallway by that medicine cabinet, and both psychics simultaneously, separately, but at the same time said, he's here right now. I said, really? Where is he? And they said, well, he's over there standing right in the middle of that cabinet. And of course I look over there, I don't see anything. Well, one of the guys had a plasma meter, and he runs over to the medicine cabinet, kicks it on, starts running it down the cabinet, and it goes beep, 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 right there at the location of where they said this apparition had been standing. So there's something going on there, and they don't want you to know about it. So Discovery dropped us, and we had a hell of a time even with a contract, getting all the money we had expended on this back, but we finally did. Now, unfortunately, since Discovery Channel footed the bill for this whole thing, they've got the rights to it, and that's why I can't show it to you, and you'll probably never see it. How's that for free media? Now, the clincher is, we took an overhead shot of the Walker Hospital, overlaid it with the layout of the old Roswell Army Airfield, and guess what? The surgical building of the old Roswell Army Airfield, which is, if the story's true, this is where they would have taken the aliens and dissected them, where they died, whatever, and it's overlays exactly with that wing of the New Mexico Rehabilitation Center, which had been the Walker Air Force Hospital, the exact location. Now, is that weird or what? So I described most of the remote viewing stories in my book, Sci-Spies, which I still have a few copies of. I think most of y'all are familiar with my book, Alien Agenda, which, if you didn't know, I've been told is the top-selling nonfiction UFO book in the world. It's been translated into a dozen languages. I'm not saying my book's any better than anybody else's. There's been plenty of good books out there, but as most of you know, they're either self-published, they're published by a small publisher, and they usually cover one aspect and one little thing. Mine, particularly for any of you who are new here and who are just now getting your feet wet in the UFO issue, I would suggest reading my book, Alien Agenda, because it is an overview. It goes all the way back to the ancient Sumerian tablets, tells about the Anunnaki, and then comes all the way forward to some of the most recent cases, and also deals with our mysterious spaceship moon. And so there's my story of remote viewing aliens, what the remote viewers have seen, what I have seen, what I've experienced, and perhaps one of the strangest stories I ever ran across